Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear,
business consultant.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear Business Consulting.
Hey, everybody. I'm Jay Shear with Jay Shear Business Consulting. We build solid foundations for service-based businesses to grow and scale and achieve the results and success they deserve. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Ryan Solis said, community is much more than belonging to something. It's about doing something together that makes belonging matter. Well, on today's episode, we talk about creating a culture of belonging, building deep community, resilient relationships, and more. Our guest is a husband and father. He's an expert on community building, an executive advisor, a keynote speaker, and an award-winning author of 3 books on community building, including the international bestseller, The Art of Community. His work is used to advise and develop leadership within global organizations, including Google, Airbnb, LinkedIn, Twitch, and Amazon. In addition, he's a founding member of the Google Vitality Lab, which focuses on the world's most pressing health and well-being challenges. Please welcome the man who in 1 year survived a plane crash, a spitting cobra attack, and acute malaria, Charles Vogl. Charles, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be invited and to spend this time with you.
As am I. Well, let's jump right in. First, I've got to find out a little bit more about all 3 of those incidents that took place in 1 year. So can you share with us a little bit about what happened there?
I'm absolutely happy to share about that. The density of those experiences in 1 year become more clear when you learn I was serving in the U.S. Peace Corps in northern Zambia, where there are planes, spitting cobras, and disease. And I was living in a rural village in northern Zambia on the Zaire border, and my primary way of getting around was hitchhiking. And northern Zambia certainly then could be and is a dangerous place. And we now know that I was infected with malaria early on in my Peace Corps service, but because I was taking the prophylaxis medication, it suppressed the symptoms enough that it wasn't clear, at least to the local medical professionals, that I had malaria. And so the way the parasites work is they keep spreading in your body and then until it becomes acute, and then eventually had to be hospitalized. Whereas if the symptoms had not been suppressed, presumably it would have been recognized earlier and it wouldn't become so acute. And then the plane crash, my parents came to visit me, and I was so remote that it took many days each way to get to my village, much of it over dirt roads that had not been graded in probably decades. And so to get just to the region where I was staying, they needed to hire a small plane to get out there and then get us out. And just so happened that the engine seized on that Cessna 210. And it was very dangerous. Our pilot did a text-perfect job keeping us alive. And while my mom was just marginally injured, it was not life-threatening, which turned out to be a miracle that we all lived, statistically speaking, where we crashed or whatever. And there you go. And let's never do that again. And then spitting cobra attack. One time I was visiting one of the Peace Corps houses, they call it, which were places we could stay while we were traveling cross country. And snakes like to find warm places, and one had gotten into the house. And then the funny story is I had probably passed it once when I was coming through the doorway. And so it was alarmed, thinking I was attacking it. And then I had grabbed something in a room and headed back out. And so to the snake's perspective, I was coming back at it. And so this is why it was already up and it started spitting me. But I didn't realize I was being attacked by a snake. I just thought someone was squirting me with a squirt gun. And in my memory, the experience all happened in extreme slow motion, where I thought, gee, why is someone spitting me with a squirt gun? And then as my eyes came up, I saw a snake up and spitting at me. And I realized in very slow motion, oh, this is venom. I'm being sprayed with venom. And then I jumped away to get away from it in slow motion. And at that time, a Peace Corps colleague had also come into the door of this building, and he saw me doing something which he later would describe as a funny dance. And that funny dance was me trying to get my limbs to work to get away from a attacking snake. And then we both jumped away from the snake, and now there was a snake between us and the only exit of this building. And it was angry and attacking. And we hid we closed the door in another room, but it was not fun. It turns out if you're going to get attacked by a snake, at least in Zambia, you want to be attacked by a spitting cobra because it's not deadly. Whereas the other poisonous snakes, you're largely going to die. So it sounds funny in the telling, but it was actually great that that's what attacked me.
Amazing. Well, that's really good information to know. So in case I'm ever in that area or areas that do have spitting cobras, at least I know what kind of dance to do.
Yeah. The get away from angry poisonous animals as quickly as possible dance.
Absolutely. And of course, in today's hyper-connected world, I suspect there's probably going to be a video of that somewhere, somehow. Maybe not of your incident, but more than likely of one a bit more current. So interestingly, you shared those stories, which I appreciate you doing. You know, there are certainly moments in life that define us, and they often change the course of our lives. What would you say is one of those moments that you've experienced?
Oh, absolutely. I have many. I don't know if I have many that define my life, but moments where I recognize I had transitioned from being one way, we could say less mature, to another that's more mature. And, you've already referenced my Peace Corps service. There was this moment where I was dropped off in a village in northern Zambia at 25 years old. And I had weeks of language training of a language I literally didn't know the name of 3 months earlier, Bemba. And we unpacked the car, and I met some of the villagers who would become my family, my host family in the area. And there was a singular moment where the Peace Corps Land Rover the Peace Corps Land Cruiser drove away. And I remember watching the dust kicked up by those tires. And there I was then in a Zambian village to live and ostensibly, to the best of my ability, make a difference. And I remember thinking in that moment, okay, I'm an adult now. When you get dropped off in an African village far, far away from a hospital or a telephone, you've grown up. I mean, you hadn't finished maturing, but it was no longer confusing to me whether I was an adolescent. And, so I remember waking up the next morning and I literally didn't know where there was potable water, where there was clean water to drink. Villagers knew, and I was in the village, so please don't think it was a mystery to them, but I didn't know. So I got up and I had what we call jerry cans and I went to my next door neighbor in the village and explained I needed water. And of course, they knew, and I started walking toward the river, which was about a mile away in memory. And of course, it's downhill because the river is in the lowest point. And this is that thing that I was doing, walking the jerry can to the river, was the most exciting thing that was happening in the village all day. The new Mzungu, which means foreigner, trying to find the water. And so it quickly became a parade of several dozen children and me with a jerry can going to the water. And here's what really happened. We get to the river and they fill it up for me because they know how to do that. And it's not potable, but you make it potable by putting chlorine in it or boiling it. But I was not strong enough to carry 30 liters of water uphill for a mile. But every village kid is. And so just as you would help a neighbor carry groceries, right? They just grabbed my water and put it on their head and, walked it up the hill for a mile. So that was a moment, right? So both the strength of like, now I'm on an adventure, and then realizing I'm a baby here and I can do nothing.
Well, the lessons were all around you, and I'm sure every moment of every day was an opportunity to learn something different. What was the draw for you to the Peace Corps? So at this time in your life, you're in your early to mid 20s.
Mm-hmm.
Why the Peace Corps?
Mm-hmm.
What were you focused on at this point, and what were you looking to accomplish? And did you discover that through the work you were doing at that point?
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
It is.
Why the Peace Corps? I was at a point in my life where I knew I wanted to make a difference. I just didn't want to go out in the world and figure out how to get mine. And I was not confused that I couldn't do that in the United States where I was living, where I'm a citizen. In fact, before I served in the Peace Corps, I was working in a homeless ministry in Southern California, feeding people who didn't have homes, and also working with volunteers who were doing that, right? And there's a seemingly infinite number of need of people who need food and housing in America. So I wasn't confused that I couldn't do that. But I wanted to find my limits. And I wanted adventure. Adventure partly meaning I wanted to learn something. I wanted to see how other people did things. And I was confident the Peace Corps, I would find my limits. And in fact, I did. Physically, spiritually, medically, culturally, linguistically, I found my limits. And I'm really happy I served in the Peace Corps when I did. And this was an era before cell phones were common. I was serving from 99 to 01. So I did not have a cell phone, and neither did the other volunteers I served with. So when you're dropped out in a village, dozens and dozens of miles from a phone, you were really far away. To give you a sense of remoteness, at one point, I was exposed to rabies. And rabies, for those who don't know, is a very deadly disease. And it's also a terrible way to die. My cat was infected with rabies, and so I was exposed, and so was my host family, quite frankly. And so I knew I needed to get word to Peace Corps headquarters in the country to let them know I was exposed, so I could get access to medicine, and then in as much as I could arrange it, medicine for my host family, who would die if they were in fact meaningfully exposed. And it took me 3 vehicles and 12 hours of hitchhiking to get to a phone to tell Peace Corps that I'd been exposed. And then I was so remote that they had to order a plane to fly up country to then meet me at the local airport to get me, because I was already outside of the window, the time window to get me medicine. So that gives you a sense of how remote I was. And today, I don't even know if Peace Corps volunteers are that remote out of communication. And I'm glad that that I got to do that, because a certain amount of resilience is built when you know largely there's no one coming to help quickly outside of the resources we have in the village, which are meaningful. Like, villagers know how to live in the village, so let's acknowledge that. Well, and then so there was a cultural part, and then most of the world does not live certainly as we live in America, or certainly as we live by what we consider our middle class Western standard. And to really understand how most of the world lives is really important. It's changed me forever. And also, I was confronted with how little I knew about the world. So I remember living in the village for a year. And you think after you live in a village for a year and you know people there and you're learning the language, like you know how it works. And the year there is seasonal for them. They're subsistence farmers.
Okay.
In Luapula province. And so each season is different. And at one point, my friends invited me to visit them in the homes that they live in near the fields where they subsistence farm. There are no tractors, right? There's no motorbikes to go back and forth. And I said yes. And so I took my mountain bike. I was led to these homes that were, in my memory, over an hour hike out into the bush, we called it. And I discovered there was this parallel village where they lived, where they migrated to the fields that I'd never been to. And I'd already been living there a year and thought I understood something about this. And it turns out, no, there's this entire cultural universe of my village I had not been exposed to. Now, I did get exposed to it in the right season, but it just blew my mind how little I understood. And it also, to be honest, created some resentment about Westerners who go to places that are very, very different for a week, for 2 weeks, for 4 weeks. either on vacation or on safari or even volunteering, and they come back and they're telling as experts about that place and those people and their ways, right? Because I lived in a village speaking Bemba and discovered a year later I knew almost nothing. Right? And maybe that's the most important lesson is I learned the scale of my hubris, and the scale of my hubris when I visit somewhere else for a week or 2 weeks or maybe a month. And I think for most Western travelers, we think visiting a place for a month is a meaningful visit and we get to know it. And I learned you learn almost nothing.
Well, you learn that you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what a tremendous experience, though. And I'm curious at this point, because it sounds like there was so much to the time that you had there, so many different experiences that you had, that you felt. Was this starting to lay some seeds at all for the type of work that you do today? When you think about community, paying attention to what you saw, what you heard, the types of questions that you were asking, those experiences, were you cataloging this somehow, some way?
I wouldn't say I was cataloging it in some organized fashion. I'm certain going to a foreign country, learning a language I didn't know the name of, to move into a village I didn't know the name of, to work with people I certainly didn't know the name of, and just commit myself to grow that way, changed me. And one of the ways I changed was understanding how much surviving, let alone thriving, under extreme challenges, in the case of Zambia at the time, an AIDS epidemic, lack of food such that 1/3 of the year was called the hunger season for very practical reasons, for living in a place where there was no effective rule of law, and where what was called government was very dangerous, and I would call it tyrannical. And I had experiences around that, learning that when we're facing those levels of challenges, the way that works is you do it together, right? You don't handle any of that by yourself or even as one family unit. And it seems odd for us coming out of, I mean this literally, a liberal Western economy where we have to prove our value. We have to establish our contribution through action, as opposed to just being born into a clan or into a tribe where we just have established value, right? It seems odd to us that how much, for example, villagers share wealth. And there is a disincentive. Why be really successful farming if you're going to share it all, right? However, the other side of that is no one dies of hunger if there's enough food, because it's communal. And I'm not advocating communism in this. I'm just acknowledging that's a different way, that has a different level of resilience when you understand the people around me are going to make sure that I don't fall down, right? And my kids, right? Or when I'm away, that they're going to rally together and make sure they're okay, which we're largely missing in this country right now. The research is overwhelmingly clear. We're living in the loneliest era of American history. The trends of connection are going down, not up. And the latest research actually shows that 15% of men have no close friend in America. 15%. Wow. And those are the men who say they have no close friends, right? That doesn't say people who have not enough or barely any. And we know that over half of Americans say they feel lonely. And keep in mind, we're all feeling lonely together, right? So it's the opposite of knowing people have our back.
So has that trend been consistent for a number of years? Has it changed over the past 5 years?
As far as Americans becoming more lonely, absolutely.
Yes.
Unfortunately, Robert Putnam out of Harvard wrote in the 1990s, Bowling Alone. And back then in the 90s, he lamented how we have become more separated. And he references the loss of bowling leagues as just an example, an emblematic change in our culture. He's written recently how it's gotten much worse since then. And that book in the 90s was a lament how we need to turn this around. So yeah, it got, and you know, I don't know how deep you want to go. There are forces in our culture that got us here. It didn't happen in a vacuum. And the unfortunate thing is those forces are actually getting stronger. So quickly, we can reference what I call the big three. Not
please do.
I know they're the big three, but everybody can recognize them. First of all, Americans are moving more than ever before. And when we do that, we move ourselves away from the people we have relationships who are supporting us around us. Not rocket science, right? And I'm not saying moving's bad or we should stop it, but note when you have a culture now where people are moving, they're constantly uprooting themselves from where they are connected, wherever those levels are. Number two, Americans have largely run away from their home faith traditions. Unfortunately, often for very good reasons. Nonetheless, we don't see the level of people coming together as they did in the 1970s, baby boomers gathering weekly around people who share their values and purpose, engaging in rituals that acknowledge how we're changing throughout their life because they're running away from that, right? And there's a bigger story about why what I consider the religious landscape in America is failing Americans who are Gen X and below. But we can acknowledge there's been a seismic shift in how we're coming together around faith. And then lastly, of the big three is the elephant, social media. Social media is a fantastic tool for connecting us with people who don't care about us. And it's a really lousy tool for connecting us deeply with the people who do care about us and show up when we're sick and make sure we get picked up from the hospital and show up when we need to move. One of the statistics I like to share is at one point, one social media platform said that I had over 1,500 friends on that particular platform. I don't know if that means I'm beating you, Jay. I hope it does because I like to win. Anyway, so at one point I was moving across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast. And I'll tell you, Jay, less than 300 people came to help me move. Actually, it was way less than 300. I'll let you guess how many. But my point is, Jay, is that number on that social media platform meant nothing. Right. And there's a zero-sum gain at some level where from 15 years old to 25, every hour we're spending on a platform that does a terrible job connecting us deeply and a really good job connecting us to people who don't care about us. When we wake up at 25 or 35, we no longer have those hours, as you know, Robert Putnam would say, in bowling leagues, creating those deeper ties. And you do that for 20 years, and this is what you get. I'll just go one more because your audience may be interested. I understand your audience are business leaders.
Yes.
We are in the most age segregated era of probably world's history, but certainly American history. And it's so bad that at one point, the research showed that the number of adults that young people had a relationship with, where they could talk about important subjects, and those adults did not have an evaluative relationship with them, i.e. grading them, hovered between 0 and 2.
Wow.
And the reason this is important is when I was in graduate school, my wife and I were hosting these dinners in our home for people to sit who didn't necessarily know each other at all or well, and just spend several hours enjoying a meal together. And I was shocked. I was in my mid-30s. My wife was in her 30s, and half of our guests were undergrads. I remember thinking, don't 19 and 20-year-olds have people way cooler than us to share a meal with? And the way the campus was situated, you had to walk in the Connecticut winter a half hour each way, or you had to wait for the university shuttle system in the Connecticut winter half hour each way. So they were spending an hour on a Friday night to spend time with, I thought, totally uncool 30-somethings to share a meal at a university where there are all these dining halls like prepaid for when you go. Well, when I read that statistic, I realized that my wife and I may have often represented 100% of the adults these undergrads knew who they could talk to about important subjects like dating and pointing their life in the right direction, who weren't grading them. And I remember it gave me chills when I read that statistic. Well, think about business leaders. Think about how many people are new in their careers that they're not connected with, and those young people in those careers have no relationships with more mature people. They have no, we're not even talking about not enough or good enough. We're talking about none. Right. And that's the state of our culture, quite frankly. And the reason I want to bring this up here is it doesn't have to be that way. And even if we can't fix the culture, you and me, Jay, we can teach and we can learn how do we do a better job in this context? It's not magic, and we know it's not happening naturally. We can just do a better job.
So let's focus then some time on that piece of it. What can we do? So the two of us, everyone that's listening right now, and before we delve into that a bit, could you give us your definition of community so we're all on the same page?
I'm so glad you asked. In my work, I specifically work with people in leadership roles. And what I mean by that is both formal and formal leadership roles. So that could be in a company. As you mentioned, I work with Google. That can be social, political, spiritual, doesn't matter. And I define a community as a group of people who share mutual concern for one another. A group of people who share mutual concern from one another. So we can look at that more carefully by noting what it doesn't mean. And it doesn't mean a group of people who are just in a place together or very often on a list. It's not a group of people who showed up at a concert or tried up your pop-up restaurant or clicked on something that said, I'm really interested in cars. That may be a starting place, but until what we could call knit together the relationships where there's mutual concern. I care about your success in your career, whether your spouse is sick, whether you're going to be housed this month, whether you're going to get access to the medicine you need. All right. Until we start knitting that together, it's not yet a community. Many people say they're working on community or building community, unfortunately, in our time. And what they're really doing is they're just marketing using community language to sound relevant because they recognize we are lonely. People want more connection. And so they'll call people members when they're just customers. Or they'll say their people are engaging when they're just getting emails announcing things. To be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a list of customers or having people read announcements. That's not community. And when we meet people who say they're building community, but when we look carefully, they're really trying to manipulate, i.e. sell something or get people to do something. We call those mirage communities because they're saying they're communities, but those of us who recognize what community looks like, when we get close enough, can see, there's no actual community there.
So let's give a real world example today of a mirage community that you've seen. Doesn't matter what the platform is, unless you want to name it. But let's pick something that our audience can relate to so they understand the difference. Because to your point that you just made, community today seems to be such a strong buzzword. I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it, but it seems like everyone is talking about, come join our community. We've built a great community. And have they really, or do they just have followers, your 1,500 friends as an example that you mentioned? And
by the way, those friends were a list of people who clicked a friend button on a platform. And to be fair, some of those 1,500 actually are part of my community, but that number means nothing. I'm really glad you asked about a real world example that's not real. So let me pick a good one. So at one point I was talking with an executive director of a prominent cultural arts nonprofit here in the Bay Area. And one of the things that they want is to have more supporters of the institution. They want to have bigger audiences, and they wanted to build community, or so they said. And they got a big grant to have a bunch of musical events that were more diverse in their genre than they usually produced. And they hoped by inviting these new audiences to this cultural institution, they would build a bigger, more diverse community. And they produced these concerts, and sure enough, a lot of people showed up, people who'd never come to their institution otherwise. And then at the end of the season, they didn't have any more engagement or people involved. And the reason is they did a really good job collecting lists of people who attended. They did a really good job of creating groups of people, in this case, audiences, in a room watching a performance. They invested not at all in connecting with these people and inviting them in ways that would allow them to connect. And what I mean by connect, I mean feel seen for who they are and believe that other people understood them at some level. We say intellectually and emotionally. Every community that you're a part of, Jay, you believe there are people there who understand who you are intellectually and emotionally. And if they don't, then they're working on stereotypes, right? One more example, I talked to the head of community, an executive at an online education company based out of New York City. And they claim they have 15,000 people go through their program every year. And they got on a video call with me and bragged about how strong their community was. And I did some quick napkin math in my head because I have general sense of how many people want to be engaged and not. And the numbers they gave me were just sounded extremely inflated and ridiculous about how many people were in their community. And I said, well, that's surprising because I would expect you to only have, whatever I said, 5,000 people engaged. And they said, oh no, we had 6,000 people on our platform, our online community platform. And I said, well, how are you defining a member here? And she said, they logged on to their platform. Mm-hmm. Jay, this year I logged on to the DMV platform. I'm not part of the DMV community, right? And, the first example is people who had an aspiration and didn't know what actions to take to actually knit together people were showing up. They thought how someone inviting them into a room to watch a performance would do it, and obviously didn't. The latter one are people who are just trying to, what I call, show smoke and mirrors. They want to brag, they have all those engagements, and if you ask them 2 questions deeper, you realize there's nothing there, right? And in my experience, unfortunately, that's more than 90% of organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, that are bragging about their communities. They've picked some number, people who logged on or people who showed up at a concert, and they've said, that's our growing community. Look, I don't have anything wrong with logons. I don't think there's anything wrong with audiences. If we are going out in the world bragging that's what community is, then we're bragging about nothing and we're continuing this alienation. And my work, you mentioned I've written 3 books on this, is really about giving leadership, real leaders here, the tools they need to go from those mirage communities to something that's actually substantive.
So with all of that said then, and thank you for sharing the example. I think that gives us a bit more context and something that we can relate to, because I'm sure we've all experienced something similar, may not be the exact industry or the exact format, but I'm sure we've all been there before. So as we look at distilling your 3 books and what you are sharing with the leaders of these companies and how they can move past this mirage type community into something that's meaningful, where we build connections, where we care deeply, and where we have shared values, what are some of the first steps that we should be taking as leaders of organizations?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So all community starts with one thing. It's always the same thing every time. And I'm always looking for it. And when I see it's not there, I know that someone's making something up. And that's an invitation. And for some reason, we're in a culture that likes to skip the invitation. And in this case, an invitation means when we tell someone we would like them to spend time with us, and they know that somebody in the world cares if they show up. If the person invited doesn't understand that somebody in the world cares if they show up, that's called an announcement. And you and I live in a world where people blast announcements all the time and there are no invitations. I'll give you an example. I was at a brunch and a sister of a friend of mine came up to me at this brunch, and she just moved to the Bay Area. And she said, Charles, I just moved to San Francisco and I want to build community in my neighborhood. So I hosted a brunch and nobody came. And she said it with this like smug kind of tone, like, can you believe people are so stupid they wouldn't even come to a brunch that I offered? I said, how can I build community in my neighborhood? Well, I don't know her, and I didn't know her neighborhood. I don't know her neighbors. There's like a gazillion things I didn't know. So I just started at the beginning. I said, how many people did you invite? And she paused and she looked past my right shoulder into the distance. And she eventually said, well, I posted on social media. Jay, she invited no one. No one showed up. There may have been other things she needed to know, but the point is, well, if we don't start there, let's not be surprised we go nowhere. Right? I've talked to a number of schools that have approached me, big schools, and they want to get parents more involved in the right way, supportive. And they wring their hands like how to get involved. And I've had more than one conversation where I said, well, what are you inviting them to? And they say, well, in October, we sent out a mass email inviting them to the fundraising gala in November. I said, well, that's not an invitation. That's an announcement. And there's nothing wrong with it. And please have your gala and please send out the mass. Just know you're not inviting them to anything because they don't know if you care if they're at table 7, right, for 3 hours watching largely other people bid on things, right? So we have to invite. And one of the things, and invitations are so powerful, Jay, they work even when people decline. Because when we send out an invitation, 2 things are happening, whether nobody ever accepts it. The first one is other people get a data point that somebody in the world thinks they belong with them. Even if that something means sharing a bowl of noodles at lunch, walking around a park for 30 minutes, sitting in a backyard and having a barbecued burger. Like they have data that somebody wants to be with them. The other thing that happens is we tell the world that we're the kind of person that can bring people together. Even if everybody says no, we've told the world we're the kind of person who can bring people together. Jay, every time you felt lonely, and I'm presuming that happened once or twice in the last 20 years of your life.
Certainly.
Every time you felt lonely, you wanted to know somebody who had the power to bring people together, right? That would have made you feel better. And what I've learned is Americans are exhausted, right? We're working long hours. For those of us who have kids, that's exhausting. Many Americans are taking care of someone sick or they're sick themselves. We may not have time to accept the invitations we want to. We still want the invitations. And I've spoken around the country now, and when I bring up the subject, I've heard really powerful stories about how an invitation alone didn't matter whether it be accepted or the event was good. The invitation alone changed the relationship. One story was a family who moved to New Jersey, and they had started attending school, and they didn't know anybody. And they got one invitation to come to one event hosted by another family in that New Jersey town. And that one invitation transformed their entire relationship to their new home.
Wow.
I've so many stories. I heard a story just last week about someone who is a teacher, and he got an invitation to the wedding of a former student. And in the invitation, the student had shared how much that teacher had been important in the student's maturation. It didn't matter whether the teacher went to the wedding or not. The invitation to participate in that wedding changed that relationship. He understood how important it was and how special their connection was. So we can always start with invitations. And then the other beginner idea I like to share is community doesn't actually happen in big rooms. I'm contacted by very big organizations, often enough global. And when they want to talk about community, they want to talk about literally filling an arena. Or they want a global online platform with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And to be fair, I have advised organizations that do fill arenas and do have millions of people logging on somewhere. Mm-hmm. But that's not where community actually gets built. It's built in what we call campfire experiences. And the reason I call them campfire experiences is simply because virtually everyone I talk to has at some point sat around a campfire and noticed that when they stood up to leave, they felt more connected with the people who sat at the campfire with them. And so we can notice what's going on at a campfire besides log burning that makes us more connected. And we like to say that there are 3 criteria that make a campfire experience a campfire experience. The first is participants are physically close enough to have the intimate conversation they want to have. And if it's online, that means the rooms are small enough. 2, they have permission to have the conversation they want to have. They're not listening to some expert who wrote a book, Talk Smart, or they're not asked to fulfill an agenda, or they're not asked to listen to a concert. Nothing wrong with those things. That's just not a campfire experience. And the last thing is all of the conditions that would distract from that conversation are handled. I'll give you an example. There won't be a football game with beer ads above my head while you're trying to have a campfire experience with me. There won't be someone approaching every few minutes to sell us raffle tickets, right? There won't be a band playing so loud we can't talk to each other. My wife works for a tech company, and at one point they had a Christmas party. And this was the only 3 hours of the year where I'd be able to meet these mysterious people that my wife spends hours and hours and hours with. She was finally going to introduce me to them. I got to this Christmas party, and there was lots of open bar. There was all you can eat, I'm not making this up, hamburgers and French fries. And the music was so loud I could talk to nobody. It was the one event a year where I could connect with all these people who see my wife throughout the year, and they created a context where I literally couldn't talk about anything because I didn't understand the campfire experience. Now, I'm not against music. I'm not against music at parties, but understand, if you're inviting spouses of hundreds of employees to connect with people for the first time ever, how about creating a context where we can have the conversation we want to have?
So let me break in for just a moment, because I want to make sure that I understand and that I've got my head wrapped around when we have create a campfire experience. Let's talk about for a moment how many, when we want to keep a group small so it can be more intimate, so we can get to know one another, have good, meaningful conversations. Are we talking 5 people, 6 people? And if we have a much larger group, would we break groups up into, we'd have 6 different campfires, let's say, of 5 people, 6 people?
Yeah. So the number is going to vary slightly depending on culture and trust. As a general rule, I'm looking for experiences of 6 people or less. What really happens is when you get bigger is if you put 8 people at a table or 10, what really happens is they break up into smaller groups of 4 or 5. So think of all the weddings you've been to, and you sat there for 3 hours at a table of 10, and you tell me, Jay, how many times have you spent 3 hours at a table of 10 at a wedding and you left thinking, oh, I'm so glad I sat next to those people. I feel so connected. I can't wait to follow up with them.
Oh my gosh. I better not say,
Exactly
but it rarely ever
Exactly
happens.
right. Exactly right. Someone spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to put their friends around tables of 10, and nobody left thinking, what a wonderful evening. I can't wait to follow up with these people I got to spend 3 hours with food and drink. Because they ignored the campfire principle. Now, maybe people don't want their friends to leave more connected and feeling support. Right? Fair enough. But there's a great example where someone spent all that money and they'll work to do that. So I like to think 6 is less. So actually, when I was working with Google early on, there was an event I was advising, and the first thing I said was get rid of big tables. And that was verboten. That was a surprise, because there was this assumption before I showed up with like, well, if you want everybody to feel connected, put everybody around big tables. Nobody's left out. And I was like, get rid of big tables. And the way the room was set up when I showed up at that event was there were a few smaller tables just because of the way the math worked out. And I sat at a table of 4. And the reason is I knew that dinner was a finite amount of time. Let's just say it was a 2-hour dinner from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. If there are 6 people and we divide 2 hours by 6, the amount of time roughly each of us can share something is meaningfully shifts from 8 to 6. We call that time math in my work.
Okay.
And I know that if there's only 4 of us, we're not splitting that time up, right? Also, at some point, and this is why the tables of 10 don't work, it's just physically hard to hear people. It's physically hard to show our attention. And so the small tables help to do that. So yes, if you have a bigger group, you break them into smaller groups. And that leads to another way to interpret the campfire principle, and that's we can look for campfire spaces. So I may not plan a bunch of intimate experiences for Jay and all of his friends, but when I invite you to a barbecue, right, or a beach party, I make sure it's set up where there are spaces that when you sit, it's comfortable for just 6 of you to have that conversation, and everything isn't set up for 10 to 15. Right? Because what's really going to happen when 15 people sit down is you can't hear everybody, so you're going to talk to people next to you anyway, and now it's awkward. So I hope that's helpful.
It is. I love that idea. And I'm thinking back to what you said about the dinners that you and your wife hosted. And as those dinners gained in popularity, were you either inviting less people so you could create the type of environment where you could build community and build those relationships? Or did you take this campfire principle and break those groups into smaller groups where they had their individual sites, if you will, where they were spending more quality time together, but not as an entire group?
So that's a great question. We do a couple things. I always limit the space. I never have a just drop by and everybody can come attitude. I think those events can be great. They're not what I want to create, because I want my guests to know they were invited. Someone wants them to be there and someone's expecting them. And for example, one of the ways that I communicate that is I'm a big believer that there should be a set table or tables, because when guests show up, they see, oh, there's a seat for me. It may not have your name on it, but it's not open tables and just grab a seat. Like, we expected 15 people and there are 15 seats. And if Jay brings his best friend who's in town and I'm surprised, we set another seat, not like, we'll figure it out, right? Because of just space, we limit our evenings to between 12 and 14, 14 uncomfortably, 12 more comfortably. And the way we make it more intimate is through ritual. And so dinners that I host and then dinners that I advise other people host who want to create connections, we ritualize it. And then there's really wonderful things happens with ritual. I realize that's a word that scares people, because when we say ritual, they think robes and fire and chanting. And all we mean by ritual is we're doing things that have meaning. And it's not the practicality of the action, it's the meaning of the action. So I'll give you a few examples of what we do around me and people who I work with who trust me. When you come to my home, at some point early in the evening, I have a basket and it's called the phone basket. And my wife and I are hosting. And so the first thing we do is we pull out our phones and we put it in the phone basket. And then we invite everybody there to put their phone in as well. And I share that what we're doing by putting our phones in is we're voting with our hands to be with the people in the room instead of the people outside the room.
Beautiful idea.
Right. And we have protocols for people who are doctors or tech and they're on call. There are ways that they can participate without being out of communication, because it's a ritual thing, not a scold you because you like your phone business. And I'll tell you, Jay, when we invite people to do this, this is very often the only room they've been in for years with people who are not distracted by texts and alerts for one meal, Jay. Right? Isn't that crazy? Like in the last 3 years, how many times you've been in a room where everybody decided they wanted to be there with you?
You know, I wonder in those first few minutes what that experience must be like, where you're like, oh, now what do I do? Right? Because we're so used to that distraction.
You have to make
but
friends.
Now we have to make friends. Right now it's communicating.
Right. So there's an example. We do have several rituals. There's an example of one. And what's going on is we're making the space what we call sacred. And all I mean by sacred is the rules are different here than they are everywhere else. So if I come to your home for Thanksgiving, Jay, my guess is I'm going to hear conversations at that Thanksgiving dinner that I'm not going to hear anywhere else. Am I right?
Absolutely.
My guess is where people sit and who sits around that table is going to be different at your table on that day than on most Tuesday mornings at your table and whenever we go to restaurants somewhere else together. Am I right?
Sure.
It's different. The rules are different there at that time. It's a sacred place. And if I don't understand that and I treat it like it's Denny's on a Thursday night, that's going to get really uncomfortable really quickly, right? Because the rules are different. So by using ritual, we create a set aside space, a sacred space where the rules are different, where we can come together in a more intimate, more fun, more honest way than we can elsewhere. Another thing that we do or rituals before we share our meals together is I articulate out loud, everybody in this room is here because someone you wanted you here. And hopefully that was obvious when people showed up and there was a set table and it's not a public space, but I say it out loud. And if you're standing with 11 other people in the room and you look around and realize, oh, that's right, we're all here because someone wanted us here, all of a sudden there's a level of welcome that's reinforced. Right. I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole because ritual is literally an entire field, and I have friends who are specialists in this, but I'm just sharing there are ways that we can make that intimate. And now that campfire is really intense is the wrong word, precious. Right. And you can imagine if you and I sat around a campfire on a beach, and before anything started, I said, Jay, I'm going to invite everybody here to put their cell phone in this backpack just for an hour and a half. I was on a campfire. And I'd like to remind you all that the only reason you're at this campfire with me is because someone wanted you to be here. And that's how you knew we were here. And that's why we're welcoming you. Everything changes.
It certainly does. What a great way to create space, to create relationships, to create the kinds of conversations that we just don't have otherwise, and making those connections, creating that community. There are so many other areas that I would love to explore with you. So we are absolutely, with your approval, going to have to schedule round 2 together, because there's so much that you have created, that you have brought to the world, that we need to dig a bit deeper on and be able to share some of those insights with our listeners. So I'd like to wrap up today with a final question to you, and I'm going to link in the show notes to all 3 of your books, all of your social platforms as well, so all of our listeners can check out your work, learn more about you, dig into your world, and connect with you as well. I think that would be incredibly valuable for everyone that's watching and listening right now. So before I do ask that final question to you, I would love it if you would give our audience a challenge.
Well, everybody listening right now didn't ask to be born or create a life in the loneliest era of American history. And we're all doing it together. So there are people in your life right now that if they have a crisis, house floods, car gets stuck in the snow, kid gets sick, there are people you know that if they have a crisis and they don't call you for help when they need it, that's going to be a problem for you. I challenge you to call 5 of those people and tell them if they have a crisis at 3 a.m. and they don't call to get help, that's a problem for you, because they're going to steal from you the chance to be the friend that you want to be. Call 5 people and tell them if they don't call you when they have a crisis, when they need help, that's a problem for you, because they're stealing from you the chance to be the friend that you want to be. And what you're doing is you're telling them they're already in a community. You just may not have told them that before.
Ooh, that is powerful. How about that, everyone? Who is ready to take up that challenge? I would love to hear what kind of responses you get. So from Charles's lips to your ears, take advantage of that one. And I appreciate you sharing that challenge with everyone. So here is my final question to you. What's the most difficult decision that you've had to make in the pursuit of the person you've become?
So my life is spiritually led. I'm doing things because I think it's informed by my faith, by my understanding of how the cosmology is connected. And I have to choose over and over again to not do the things that are conventional in an economy that tells us bigger, more, and faster is the best. Bigger, more, and faster is the best. Because the truth is, Jay, everything that is precious to you, everything that you would grab or protect with your life if your home was threatened, none of them are the biggest, the fastest, or the most scalable. And I need to keep reminding myself to live my life to make it precious, relevant, and make sure it matters, and trust that that's good enough, maybe even the best.
So good. So good. Thank you. thank you so much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat, for bringing your works to life, for sharing of your experiences, of your knowledge with all of us. And I truly look forward to continuing our dialogue together, continuing to grow our relationship and learning more about one another. And I'm grateful for you and thank you.
Thank you, Jay. This is fun.
Absolutely. And for all of you, thank you so very much for watching and listening. And I would love it if you would take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. Share something that you learned in this episode. And if you think that a friend could benefit from this as well, please share that with them. And to learn more about how Jay Shear Business Consulting can help your service-based business, all you need to do is visit jayshearbusinessconsulting.com. And until next time, keep learning, keep growing. Connect with Charles on the links that we're going to provide in the show notes, and we will see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.
Jay Shear,
Jay Shear,
Jay Shear,
Jay Shear
Business Consultant.
Jay Shear
Jay Shear Business Consulting.